There is a moment that happens in many relationships with someone emotionally avoidant that feels confusing, painful, and almost impossible to understand. At the beginning, everything feels intense. The connection feels deep, natural, almost magnetic. Conversations flow easily. Attention feels genuine. There is curiosity, warmth, and a sense that something meaningful is building between two people. But then something changes. Slowly, quietly, and often without explanation, the emotional energy begins to fade. Messages become shorter. Responses become delayed. The enthusiasm that once felt effortless begins to feel distant. And the person who once seemed so emotionally present suddenly feels like they are slipping further and further away. Most people respond to this moment in the same way. They try harder, they reach out more, they explain their feelings, they attempt to fix the distance they can feel growing. From the outside, this reaction makes perfect sense. When someone important starts pulling away, the natural instinct is to close the gap, to restore the connection, to bring things back to how they used to feel. But what most people do not realize is that with someone who has avoidant tendencies, this reaction often creates the exact opposite result. The more the distance is chased, the more the avoidant mind begins to retreat, and suddenly the person who once felt close begins to feel almost unreachable. This is the moment when many people begin asking themselves the same painful question: what did I do wrong? The truth is, in many cases, nothing dramatic actually happened. The shift that occurred was not always about losing feelings. It was often about a dynamic quietly changing in a way the avoidant nervous system interprets as pressure. And once that pressure appears, even unintentionally, the avoidant mind begins to protect itself by creating distance. But here is something most people never realize about this pattern. The distance does not always mean the feelings disappeared. Sometimes the connection is still there beneath the surface, buried under layers of emotional defense, independence, and the instinct to protect personal space. And this is where something very surprising begins to happen, because there is a simple shift that can change the entire emotional dynamic between two people, a shift that often causes avoidance to start thinking about someone again in a way that feels almost obsessive. Not because of manipulation, not because of games, but because of how the avoidant mind naturally reacts to emotional space, independence, and curiosity. Most people misunderstand what happens inside the avoidant mind when someone starts chasing the connection. On the surface, it might look like the avoidant simply lost interest, but internally, something more complex is taking place. Avoidant individuals often experience closeness differently than others. Emotional intimacy can feel meaningful, but it can also feel overwhelming when it becomes too intense or too constant. The moment they begin sensing that someone else's emotional stability is becoming heavily dependent on them, their nervous system interprets that closeness as a potential loss of freedom. And that feeling alone can trigger the instinct to pull away. When messages start coming more frequently, when reassurance is constantly needed, when someone begins trying to talk about the relationship repeatedly in order to fix the distance, the avoidant brain starts to feel surrounded by emotional demands. Even if those demands are expressed gently or lovingly, they can still feel heavy to someone who is wired to guard their independence. Instead of feeling closer, they begin feeling responsible for someone else's emotional state. And responsibility is something the avoidant nervous system instinctively resists. The more someone tries to pull them back emotionally, the stronger their internal need for space becomes. This is why chasing rarely works with someone who is avoidant. The more attention they receive during their withdrawal phase, the more their brain registers the connection as pressure. And pressure is exactly what causes them to move further away. It is not because they enjoy hurting anyone. It is not because they intentionally want to create confusion. It is because distance is the only tool their nervous system knows how to use to regulate overwhelming closeness. For the person on the other side, this can feel incredibly painful. It can feel like the connection meant nothing. It can feel like affection was replaced with coldness overnight. But the truth is that many avoidants do not lose feelings the way people imagine. Instead, they bury those feelings under layers of emotional space until the pressure disappears. There is an invisible rule that quietly exists inside most avoidant attachment patterns, and it shapes almost every dynamic they experience in relationships. This rule is rarely spoken out loud, and most avoidants themselves are not consciously aware of it, but it operates beneath the surface of their emotional reactions. The rule is simple. The more someone needs them emotionally, the more they feel the urge to protect their independence. To someone with a secure or anxious attachment style, closeness often feels like safety, but to someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness can sometimes feel like the beginning of losing themselves. Their independence becomes their emotional safety zone. Their personal space becomes the place where they feel calm, regulated, and in control. When someone enters that space too quickly or too intensely, the avoidant brain interprets it as a threat to that independence, even when the connection is meaningful, even when they genuinely care. This is why many avoidants appear warm and engaged in the early stages of connection. At the beginning, everything feels light. There is curiosity, there is excitement, there is emotional exploration without pressure. But as the bond deepens and emotional expectations begin forming, the avoidant nervous system starts noticing the potential weight of the connection. They begin imagining the responsibility that might come with maintaining that closeness. And that is when the internal conflict begins. Part of them may genuinely enjoy the connection, but another part begins quietly calculating how much of their freedom might disappear if the relationship becomes too emotionally demanding. That inner conflict often leads to subtle distancing behaviors, less communication, slower responses, more focus on personal space. And for the person on the other side, it can feel like a sudden emotional disappearance. But internally, the avoidant mind is not always running away from the person. Sometimes it is simply trying to regain a sense of autonomy. One of the most misunderstood moments in relationships with avoidance is the point where attraction appears to fade. Many people believe this is the moment when the avoidant simply stops caring. But attraction rarely disappears in such a sudden and permanent way. More often, it becomes buried under the emotional pressure that unintentionally builds inside the dynamic. When someone begins focusing heavily on maintaining the connection, the energy of the relationship subtly changes. Conversations shift from curiosity to reassurance. Interactions shift from exploration to emotional maintenance. And without realizing it, the relationship starts revolving around preventing distance rather than enjoying connection. This shift is small, but it is powerful. Because when the energy of a relationship becomes centered around holding someone close, it can remove the sense of freedom that originally allowed attraction to grow. Avoidants often experience attraction through emotional space, through the ability to approach connection voluntarily rather than feeling pulled into it. When that voluntary feeling disappears, attraction becomes tangled with obligation, and obligation is something the avoidant nervous system instinctively resists. So instead of leaning in, they lean back. Instead of feeling drawn closer, they create distance in order to restore the feeling of personal choice. From the outside, it looks like emotional withdrawal, but internally, it is often a form of self-regulation. They are trying to recreate the emotional space that originally made the connection feel safe. This is where the simple shift begins to matter more than anything else. Most people assume that the way to bring an avoidant closer again is through effort, through reassurance, through proving loyalty, care, and emotional commitment. But with avoidance, the opposite dynamic often creates the strongest impact. The shift is not about ignoring them or pretending not to care. It is about reclaiming emotional independence. It is about slowly redirecting attention back toward your own life, your own growth, your own sense of stability without relying on their presence to feel complete. When this shift happens, something subtle changes in the emotional atmosphere between two people. The pressure disappears. The energy of pursuit fades. The relationship stops feeling like something that requires constant emotional maintenance, and suddenly the avoidant nervous system begins to relax. For the first time in a long time, the connection no longer feels like a responsibility they must manage. It begins to feel like something they can approach freely again. And this is where curiosity begins quietly returning. Because when someone who once chased the connection begins living fully without chasing it anymore, the avoidant mind notices the change. The attention they once received constantly is no longer guaranteed. The emotional certainty they once relied on becomes quieter, and the space that appears inside that silence begins to create something powerful inside the avoidant mind. Curiosity. And curiosity is often the first step towards something deeper, beginning to grow again. Curiosity is something the avoidant mind experiences very differently than emotional pressure. Pressure feels heavy. It feels like responsibility, expectation, and the quiet fear of losing independence. But curiosity feels light. It feels voluntary. It allows them to move towards someone instead of feeling pulled toward them. And when the dynamic shifts from pursuit to independence, curiosity begins to appear in places where silence once lived. At first, the avoidant might not even fully understand why their mind starts drifting back to the person they once pulled away from. Nothing dramatic has happened. There were no big conversations forcing closeness. There was no emotional chase trying to repair the distance. Instead, something quieter happened. The person who once tried so hard to keep the connection alive slowly began redirecting their energy back into their own life. They became less available emotionally in ways that felt natural, not cold. They stopped trying to force the relationship to feel secure every day. They stopped searching for reassurance in every interaction. And in that absence of pressure, the avoidant nervous system begins to settle. When the mind is no longer overwhelmed by the expectation to constantly respond emotionally, something interesting begins to happen. The avoidant no longer feels the need to run. And when the need to run disappears, the mind begins looking back at the connection from a different perspective. Thoughts start appearing unexpectedly. Small memories begin surfacing again. Moments that once felt simple now carry a quiet emotional weight. And without realizing it, the avoidant begins wondering what the other person is doing, how their life is moving, and whether the connection they stepped away from is still there somewhere in the background. This is the stage where emotional detachment becomes powerful, but not in the way most people think. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood as becoming cold or pretending not to care. But the shift that truly changes the dynamic is not about shutting off feelings. It is about no longer depending on the avoidant for emotional stability. When someone reaches a point where their happiness is no longer tied to whether the avoidant responds quickly or shows attention consistently, their energy changes in a subtle but noticeable way. They become calmer. Their conversations feel lighter. They no longer carry the invisible tension of needing the interaction to reassure them. And that emotional calm creates a very different atmosphere for someone who is avoidant, because avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional expectations, even when those expectations are not spoken out loud. When someone is constantly hoping for reassurance, it can create an unspoken pressure that the avoidant mind instinctively feels. But when that expectation disappears, the connection begins to feel safe again. The avoidant can talk without feeling like every interaction must carry emotional significance. They can engage without feeling like they are responsible for someone else's emotional balance. And suddenly, the same conversations that once felt heavy begin feeling comfortable again. This comfort is important because it removes the internal alarm system that often pushes avoidance away from deeper emotional involvement. When the relationship no longer feels like something they must manage carefully to avoid hurting someone, they become more open to simply experiencing it again. And when that openness begins to grow, their attention starts returning in ways that feel almost automatic. Silence plays a powerful role in this transformation, even though most people fear silence more than anything else. When someone they care about becomes distant, the instinct during silence is usually to fill it, to send another message, to ask another question, to reopen the conversation so the connection does not feel like it is fading. But silence has a psychological effect that many people underestimate. When there is constant communication, the mind becomes used to a steady stream of emotional input. There is little space for reflection because everything is happening in real time. But when silence appears, the mind begins processing things differently. It begins replaying past conversations. It begins wondering about things that were once obvious. It begins asking questions that were never asked before. For the avoidant mind, this space can become surprisingly powerful because when they are no longer responding to constant emotional signals from the other person, they begin noticing the absence of those signals. The attention that once surrounded them is no longer guaranteed. The emotional energy they once felt directed toward them becomes quieter, and in that quiet space, their mind begins filling the silence with its own thoughts. They might find themselves remembering moments that once felt simple but now feel meaningful, a conversation that made them feel understood, a moment where they felt unexpectedly comfortable, a time when the connection felt effortless. These memories begin resurfacing because silence creates the psychological room for reflection, and reflection often leads to something that looks very different from the distance that once existed. It leads to renewed emotional focus. At some point during this shift, something subtle begins happening inside the avoidance internal world. Their attention, which once moved away from the connection, begins slowly turning back toward it. But this does not always happen in dramatic ways. Avoidants rarely express their curiosity openly at first. Instead, it shows up quietly. They might check social media more often than before. They might reread old messages unexpectedly. They might ask mutual friends casual questions that appear harmless but carry deeper meaning beneath the surface. These small behaviors are not random. They are signs that the avoidant mind has started re-engaging with the connection internally. When someone is constantly available emotionally, the avoidant mind sometimes takes that availability for granted because it feels permanent. But when that constant attention disappears and is replaced with independence, the emotional dynamic changes. The avoidant no longer knows exactly where they stand in the other person's life. The certainty that once existed becomes less clear, and uncertainty naturally activates curiosity. Human psychology is deeply influenced by curiosity. When something becomes slightly unpredictable, the mind begins paying closer attention to it. It begins searching for answers. It begins observing more carefully. And for avoidance, this observation phase is often the beginning of emotional reconnection. Because while they may not reach out immediately, their mind is already moving back toward the person they once distanced themselves from. The connection begins existing in their thoughts again, not as pressure, not as responsibility, but as something intriguing that they want to understand. Eventually, curiosity and reflection reach a point where they begin transforming into something stronger. Thoughts that once appeared occasionally begin showing up more often. The avoidant might catch themselves wondering what the other person is doing late at night. They might suddenly remember details about conversations that once felt small but now feel meaningful. They might even feel a quiet sense of loss when they realize the emotional presence that once existed in their life has become distant. This stage is where the avoidance emotional focus begins intensifying, and sometimes it surprises even them, because when the pressure disappeared, the defensive walls they built to protect their independence also began lowering slowly. Without those defenses constantly activated, the feelings they once pushed aside start becoming more visible again. And that is when the connection can begin occupying more space in their thoughts than it did before. They may not describe it as obsession, but internally it can start feeling very close to that. The mind keeps returning to the same questions. What happened to the connection? Why does the silence feel different now? Is the other person truly moving forward without them? And most importantly, did they walk away from something that actually mattered more than they realized at the time? These questions do not appear because someone chased them harder. They appear because the emotional environment changed in a way that allowed the avoidant mind to process the connection without fear. And once that fear begins fading, the feelings that were once buried beneath distance can begin rising back to the surface in ways that feel powerful, confusing, and sometimes impossible for them to ignore. When the avoidant mind reaches this stage, something deeply conflicting begins happening inside them. On one side, there is the familiar instinct that has guided most of their relationships for years, the instinct to stay emotionally safe by keeping distance. But on the other side, there is a quieter feeling that begins growing stronger with time, a feeling of curiosity mixed with something that looks a lot like longing. This internal conflict is something most people never see because avoidants rarely talk openly about it. From the outside, they may still appear calm, distant, or focused on their own life, but internally, their thoughts can become surprisingly loud. They start replaying interactions in their mind. They remember the moments when the connection felt natural and easy. They remember feeling understood in ways they rarely experience, and slowly they begin noticing something that unsettles them. The emotional emotional space that once felt comfortable now feels different. The silence that once felt like relief now carries a strange sense of absence. The person they once distanced themselves from is no longer emotionally present in the same way. The constant reassurance is gone. The attention they quietly relied on is no longer surrounding them. And that absence begins creating emotional awareness that did not exist before. The avoidant mind starts realizing that the connection they stepped away from might have held more meaning than they allowed themselves to admit at the time. But because avoidants struggle with direct emotional confrontation, they rarely rush into action immediately. Instead, they stay inside this internal conflict for a while, observing their own feelings, trying to understand why the connection keeps returning to their thoughts. During this phase, something subtle but powerful often begins happening. The avoidant starts watching, not in an obvious way, but in quiet, careful ways that reveal how much their attention has shifted. They may start noticing things they once ignored. They might scroll through old messages late at night. They might check updates online more frequently than before. Sometimes they even revisit memories connected to the relationship, moments that once seemed small but now feel emotionally significant. This watching behavior is not random curiosity. It is the avoidant mind trying to reconnect with a feeling it once stepped away from. Because when the emotional pressure disappeared, the connection stopped feeling dangerous. It stopped feeling like something that might trap them or take away their independence. Instead, it began feeling like something they could approach slowly on their own terms. And when avoidants feel like they have control over the pace of emotional closeness, their resistance weakens dramatically. They no longer feel the need to protect themselves from the relationship. Instead, they begin exploring their feelings in small, private ways. The mind starts asking questions that once felt unnecessary. Is that person truly moving forward without me? Are they happier now? Do they still think about me the way I seem to be thinking about them? These questions begin occupying more mental space with time, and what started as quiet observation slowly transforms into something deeper: emotional awareness. As this awareness grows, the avoidant begins feeling something they rarely allow themselves to experience openly: vulnerability. Not the kind of vulnerability that appears during emotional conversations, but a deeper kind that happens internally. When someone realizes they may have misjudged the importance of a connection, they begin recognizing that the person they once stepped away from was not trying to trap them. They were not trying to control their independence. They were simply trying to hold on to something that felt meaningful to them. And now that the emotional dynamic has changed, the avoidant starts seeing the relationship from a completely different perspective. The absence of pressure makes the memories clearer. The distance allows reflection to happen without defensiveness. And the independence the other person now carries becomes strangely attractive. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by emotional expectations, the avoidant begins seeing someone who appears strong, stable, and self-contained, someone who is living their life fully without chasing reassurance. That image can be incredibly powerful to the avoidant mind because it removes the fear that closeness will automatically lead to emotional suffocation. It suggests something different: the possibility of connection without losing independence. And for someone who has spent their life protecting their autonomy, that possibility is deeply intriguing. Eventually, the thoughts become too persistent to ignore. The avoidant may try to distract themselves with work, hobbies, or other relationships, but the connection keeps resurfacing in quiet moments. Late at night, when everything becomes still, during random moments in the day when something reminds them of a conversation they once had, or when they notice the silence where communication once existed, and that silence begins to feel heavier than they expected, because for the first time, the distance was not created by someone chasing them or demanding answers. It appeared because the other person simply stepped back and focused on their own life. That kind of distance is different. It does not feel like pressure. It feels like a quiet possibility of loss. And the avoidant mind begins asking itself a question it rarely asks in relationships. What if this connection was actually important? What if the person who once gave so much emotional energy is now truly moving forward without them? These questions can create a surprising emotional reaction inside someone who once felt certain that distance was the safest choice. Because the idea of losing the connection completely can suddenly feel more uncomfortable than the closeness they once feared. And when that realization appears, something begins shifting inside their emotional priorities. close. This is usually the stage where the avoidant begins thinking about reaching out again, but the way they approach reconnection rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Avoidants almost never return with grand emotional confessions or intense declarations of missing someone. Instead, their return tends to be subtle, cautious, and almost casual on the surface. They might send a simple message that seems small and ordinary: a greeting, a random question, a comment about something that reminded them of the other person. To someone who has been waiting for emotional clarity, this message can feel confusing because it does not fully reveal the emotional process that led to it. But behind that simple message often exists weeks or even months of quiet internal conflict. The avoidant has been thinking, observing, remembering, and slowly allowing themselves to reconnect with feelings they once buried under distance. Reaching out is their way of testing the emotional space again. They want to see how the interaction feels now that the dynamic has changed. They want to know whether the connection can exist without the pressure that once scared them away. And most importantly, they want to feel whether the emotional energy between the two of you still exists. Because by this point, the person who once occupied their thoughts occasionally may now be appearing in their mind far more often than they ever expected. Not because they were chased harder, but because the silence, independence, and emotional shift created something far more powerful in the avoidant mind: the freedom to finally feel the connection without fear. When that first message finally appears, it often looks small on the surface. Sometimes it is just a simple greeting, sometimes it is a casual question that seems almost random. It may even look like nothing more than a polite check-in. But for someone who understands the avoidant mind, that moment carries far more meaning than the words themselves, because behind that small message exists a long internal journey that most people never see. The avoidant had to move through curiosity, reflection, emotional awareness, and internal conflict before reaching the point where they felt safe enough to reconnect. To the person receiving the message, emotions can immediately rise to the surface again. Hope may return quickly. Old feelings may rush back all at once. After all, this is the person who once felt so close, the person whose distance once created so many questions and sleepless nights, and now they are suddenly here again, appearing in your messages as if the silence between you was only a brief pause. But this moment is more important than it appears, because the way the dynamic unfolds from here will determine whether the avoidance curiosity grows stronger or whether the old cycle quietly begins repeating itself. If the response immediately returns to the old energy of chasing, seeking reassurance, and trying to reestablish the relationship exactly as it was before, the avoidant nervous system can quickly feel the same pressure that caused the distance in the first place. The shift that made them return begins disappearing the moment emotional urgency replaces calm independence, and the avoidant mind can feel that change almost instantly. This is the mistake many people make when avoidants reappear in their lives. The excitement of seeing them return can cause someone to unconsciously fall back into the same patterns that existed before the distance. Suddenly, there is a desire to talk constantly again, to clarify the relationship, to ask questions about why they disappeared, to secure reassurance that they will not leave again. All of these reactions are completely understandable. When someone you care about returns after a long silence, it feels natural to want emotional certainty. But the avoidant mind rarely responds well to emotional urgency, especially early in reconnection. When the interaction immediately becomes heavy with expectations or emotional explanations, the avoidant can feel their internal alarm system activating again. The connection begins feeling like something that requires constant emotional management, and once again, their instinct becomes distance. Not because they do not care, not because they planned to hurt anyone, but because the emotional environment begins resembling the one that once made them feel overwhelmed. This is why maintaining this shift is so important. The same calm independence that created curiosity in the avoidant mind must remain present even when they return. That independence is what makes the connection feel safe to them. It tells their nervous system that closeness does not automatically mean losing freedom. It shows them that the person they are reconnecting with has their own life, their own stability, and their own emotional center. When someone maintains this independence during reconnection, something powerful begins happening inside the avoidant mind. The connection feels different than it did before. Conversations feel lighter, interactions feel voluntary instead of emotionally required. The avoidant no longer feels like they must carefully manage someone else's emotional state with every message or conversation. And because of that, they begin relaxing into the connection in ways that were not possible before. Instead of stepping back when things become emotionally close, they may begin leaning in more gradually. Instead of feeling the need to escape the connection, they may start seeking it out more often. The emotional space that once felt necessary for survival is now naturally built into the dynamic because the other person is no longer chasing closeness constantly. This balance is something avoidants rarely experience in relationships. Many of their past connections may have felt intense but overwhelming. Others may have felt safe but emotionally distant. But a connection that contains both warmth and independence can feel uniquely compelling to them. It allows them to explore emotional closeness without triggering their deepest fears about losing autonomy. And as they continue experiencing this balance dynamic, their attention often begins focusing more and more on the person who provides it. This is the stage where something that feels almost like obsession can begin forming inside the avoidant mind, not in a dramatic or chaotic way, but in a quiet, persistent way that slowly grows stronger over time. They begin thinking about the connection more frequently. They begin wondering what the other person is doing when they are not talking. They begin noticing how different this relationship feels compared to others they have experienced before. And most importantly, they begin recognizing that the emotional safety they once searched for through distance might actually exist inside this connection itself. The independence of the other person becomes incredibly attractive because it removes the fear of being emotionally trapped. Instead of feeling responsible for maintaining someone else's happiness, they feel free to simply be present in the relationship. That freedom allows their genuine interest to grow without resistance. And when avoidants feel both freedom and emotional connection at the same time, their focus can become surprisingly intense. They may reach out more often, they may initiate conversations they once avoided, they may even start sharing parts of themselves that they rarely reveal. This is not something that happens because someone tried to force them to care more. It happens because the emotional environment finally feels safe enough for their interest to grow naturally. And this reveals the deeper truth behind the simple shift that changes everything. The shift was never about making someone jealous. It was never about pretending not to care or playing emotional games. The shift was about reclaiming your own center. It was about building a life that does not revolve around someone else's attention or approval. When someone reaches that point of genuine independence, their energy becomes different. They are still capable of connection, warmth, and affection, but those things come from a place of stability rather than need. And that stability is exactly what the avoidant mind finds so compelling, because deep down, avoidants are not running from connection itself. They are running from the fear of losing themselves inside it. When they encounter someone who can love without clinging, who can care without chasing, and who can remain emotionally grounded even in uncertainty, the connection begins to feel safe in a way they rarely experience. That safety allows their curiosity to grow. That curiosity allows their attention to return, and that returning attention can eventually become something far stronger than it ever was before. Not because someone fought harder to keep them, but because someone became strong enough to let the connection exist without fear, pressure, or emotional dependence. And sometimes that quiet strength is exactly what makes the avoidant mind turn back, look closer, and realize that the connection they once walked away from might have been far more meaningful than they ever allowed themselves to see.